Every single time you lose your temper, over-explain yourself, or let someone bait you into a reactive argument, you're handing them complete control over your nervous system. In behavioral profiling, an emotional reactor is classified as an easy target. The moment your emotions breach your cognitive perimeter, your micro-behaviors leak your submissive frame. Your vocal pitch climbs, your posture grows tense, your blink rate spikes, and your focus collapses into defensive panic. You stop operating as an analytical mind and regress into a predictable biological puppet. Manipulators, high conflict personalities, and opportunistic individuals thrive on this exact vulnerability. They don't need complex strategies to dominate an emotional fool. They just press the right psychological button and watch you destroy your own leverage. Most people spend their entire lives reacting to every petty insult, passive-aggressive jab, and manufactured crisis. They convince themselves that being passionate or expressive is a virtue, completely blind to the fact that their emotional volatility makes them weak, manageable, and effortlessly controlled. If you click away right now, you choose to remain an easy target, a reactive entity whose mood, decisions, and trajectory can be dictated by anyone who knows how to trigger you. Stay right here. Over the next few minutes, we will break down the exact behavioral mechanics required to kill emotional reactivity, establish an unshakable poker face, and build an internal fortress that guarantees total situational dominance. In high-stakes behavioral analysis, we do not evaluate an individual's strength by their loud outbursts or performative aggression. We evaluate it by their degree of emotional stability. An emotional reactor is fundamentally an asset with zero security. When you allow external circumstances, rude comments, or sudden setbacks to instantly dictate your internal state, you advertise to the room that your psychological perimeter is completely unmonitored. Your vocal cadence loses its grounded tone, your body language performs anxious, pacifying gestures, and your higher analytical brain shuts down. To operate as a sovereign individual, you must execute a cold, deliberate shift. Stop being an emotional fool and start processing the world through ruthless, strategic clarity. Modern culture encourages you to validate every passing feeling, treating raw emotion as if it represents ultimate personal truth. In operational reality, an uncalibrated feeling is merely a primitive neurochemical spike designed for survival, not strategic decision-making. When you treat temporary surges of anger, fear, or insecurity as absolute mandates for action, you behave like a child. High-status operators recognize that emotions make terrible generals. They acknowledge internal sensations without surrendering their frame to them, ensuring that logical analysis always maintains command over temporary physiological noise. Every social ecosystem contains individuals who actively seek to trigger your emotional responses to gain leverage over you. When a manipulator throws an insult, an unfair critique, or a passive-aggressive bait, they are placing a hook directly into your awareness. If you snap back, defend yourself aggressively, or visibly flinch, you swallow the hook completely. You give them the exact neurochemical satisfaction they were seeking. The ultimate countermove is complete, cold indifference. By keeping your face motionless and your posture anchored, you force the provoker to confront the total failure of their manipulation attempt. The metric that separates an emotional fool from a high-status operator is the space they construct between stimulus and response. An emotional fool functions on an instant reflex loop. Trigger occurs, emotional explosion follows. A sovereign mind enforces a non-negotiable delay. When presented with high-friction input, you hold your frame still, take a slow diaphragmatic breath, and evaluate the input purely as cold data. You ask yourself a single analytical question: Does responding to this serve my strategic goals? If the answer is no, you offer zero physical, verbal, or emotional payment. Controlling your emotions is not an invisible, abstract concept. It demands immediate physical expression through nonverbal discipline. When tension escalates in a room, your body language must signal absolute internal composure. You freeze unnecessary micromovements, keep your respiratory rate slow and even, and allow your vocal delivery to drop into a resonant, down-toned register. You stop nodding along out of politeness, eliminate nervous fidgeting, and hold a neutral, unhurried gaze. This total physical stillness acts as an undeniable nonverbal wall that exposes the frantic, uncalibrated energy of anyone trying to rattle you. Stopping your emotional reactivity is the ultimate act of self-command and personal power. You stop blaming toxic people, stressful environments, or chaotic circumstances for your internal state. You accept full, radical accountability for every reaction you allow past your perimeter. Set your internal standards so high that no external observer possesses the leverage required to disrupt your peace. Lock in your frame, master your nonverbal output, and navigate every room with quiet, unyielding cognitive control. Emotional hijacking as an operational vulnerability represents the complete catastrophic collapse of an individual's internal perimeter, surrendering strategic control to raw biological impulse. In behavioral profiling and high-stakes human analysis, emotional hijacking occurs when an unexpected environmental trigger, calculated insult, or high-friction scenario bypasses the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational strategic reasoning, and directly activates the limbic system. The moment your emotions breach your cognitive filters, your internal baseline evaporates. You stop operating as a calculating high-status mind and regress into a reactive biological asset whose behavior is entirely predictable, manageable, and effortlessly steered. In any social, corporate, or interpersonal hierarchy, an individual who loses their emotional composure instantly advertises that their psychological perimeter is unmonitored and that their decisions can be easily manipulated by anyone who understands which neurochemical buttons to press. The operational hazard of emotional reactivity lies in its immediate, nonverbal betrayal of your submissive state. The central nervous system cannot hide an uncalibrated emotional spike without deliberate, rigorous conditioning. When you experience anger, panic, or defensive insecurity, your body leaks these vulnerabilities through clear physiological signals. Your vocal pitch rises in search of rapport or defense. Your respiration becomes shallow and rapid. Your blink rate spikes, and your physical posture becomes rigid or performs anxious, pacifying gestures. To a trained observer or high-conflict personality, these nonverbal indicators are clear invitations for exploitation. Manipulators do not require sophisticated strategies to dominate an emotional reactor. They simply throw a piece of emotional bait, a subtle insult, a passive-aggressive jab, or a manufactured delay, and watch you destroy your own leverage through frantic over-explanation, aggressive posturing, or submissive compliance. Furthermore, reacting on raw emotional impulse destroys your capacity for long-term strategic execution. When you allow a temporary neurochemical surge to dictate your immediate speech or action, you trade permanent leverage for fleeting emotional relief. The emotional reactor feels a brief, false sense of power when they yell, deliver a harsh retort, or storm out of a room, completely blind to the fact that they have just handed the surrounding operators total control over the interaction. By demonstrating that your internal baseline is fragile and easily disrupted by external noise, you forfeit your situational authority. High-value opportunities, leadership positions, and strategic dominance are never awarded to individuals who function as emotional hazards. They are reserved for those whose cognitive frame remains completely calm, unbothered, and impenetrable under intense pressure. Eradicating emotional hijacking requires treating raw feelings as low-value physiological suggestions rather than mandatory directives for action. When an intense emotion surfaces within your awareness, you must cultivate the immediate discipline to observe it with cold, clinical detachment. You do not deny the existence of the neurochemical spike, nor do you allow it to alter your physical posture or dictate your words. You evaluate the emotion purely as raw data, auditing why it occurred and recognizing that reacting to it will actively undermine your long-term objectives. By starving emotional spikes of physical and verbal expression, you insulate your central nervous system against external manipulation. You transform yourself from a fragile, easily baited reactor into a self-contained, sovereign operator whose internal baseline remains unshaken, regardless of the chaos, hostility, or emotional bait introduced into your environment. Deconstructing emotional conditioning begins with the cold, unvarnished realization that your raw feelings are merely automated physiological suggestions, not non-negotiable directives for human action. In human behavioral mechanics and cognitive profiling, the vast majority of individuals exist in a state of psychological slavery to their own neurochemistry, operating under the flawed belief that every internal sensation must be validated, expressed, and acted upon immediately. When you feel a sudden wave of irritation, anxiety, or defensive pride, your brain is simply executing an ancient biological survival script designed for immediate environmental friction. That physiological reaction, the spike in heart rate, the sudden rush of heat, the urge to snap back or justify yourself, is merely raw biological data passing through your nervous system. An emotional fool accepts this data as absolute reality and surrenders their frame to it, while a sovereign operator treats it as unverified background noise that carries zero operational authority over their actions. The primary mechanism of emotional conditioning is the subconscious feedback loop that rewards instantaneous reactivity with short-term neurochemical relief. When someone provokes you and you immediately strike back verbally, your brain experiences a fleeting release of tension, tricking you into believing that you have asserted power or defended your dignity. In reality, you have succumbed to a primitive stimulus response mechanism that degrades your long-term leverage and reveals your cognitive fragility to every trained observer in the room. By continuously validating these biological urges, you condition your brain to default to high-stress, low-status reactivity whenever external friction occurs. You become an individual whose internal state is dictated entirely by external variables, surrendering your personal autonomy to anyone who understands how to trigger your primitive survival loops. To break this conditioning, you must systematically audit the origin and validity of your internal emotional states before allowing them to manifest in your behavior. The moment an intense emotional surge attempts to hijack your central nervous system, you step back into a posture of absolute metacognitive observation. You examine the sensation through a cold, analytical lens, asking whether the emotion serves your long-term strategic objectives or if it is merely an uncalibrated biological reflex reacting to cheap social bait. You realize that feeling an emotion and executing an action are two entirely separate, decoupled processes. You possess the absolute, non-negotiable power to allow an emotional surge to rise and dissipate within your physiology without ever letting it alter your facial expressions, adjust your physical posture, or influence a single word that leaves your mouth. Ultimately, deconstructing your emotional conditioning transforms your internal architecture into an impenetrable fortress of cognitive self-command. When you stop viewing your feelings as ultimate personal truths and begin treating them as manageable physiological data, external observers lose all capacity to manipulate your trajectory. Insults, passive-aggressive traps, and high-pressure social environments lose their ability to destabilize your frame because you no longer pay emotional tax on cheap environmental inputs. You operate with a quiet, unhurried certainty, free from the volatile swings of uncalibrated neurochemistry. By mastering your physiological responses and enforcing total executive authority over your internal state, you establish an unshakable operational baseline that commands absolute respect and maintains total situational dominance in every environment you enter. The nonverbal signature of emotional balance is the direct physical manifestation of a central nervous system that refuses to yield its authority to external friction or temporary physiological noise. In behavioral profiling and high-stakes human analysis, true psychological authority is never declared through loud verbal assertions, aggressive posturing, or frantic attempts to dominate a conversation. Instead, it is communicated instantly and continuously through the total absence of nonverbal leaks. An uncalibrated, emotionally reactive individual continuously leaks their internal state to every trained observer in the room. Their vocal pitch elevates in search of defensive rapport, their eye blink rate spikes under social pressure, their breath becomes shallow and rapid, and their hands perform nervous, self-pacifying behaviors to soothe their rising internal anxiety. These micro-behaviors are clear indicators that their internal baseline is fragile, easily disrupted, and entirely exposed to targeted environmental triggers. Achieving a nonverbal frame of absolute emotional balance requires taking deliberate, conscious command of your physiology long before tension escalates in a room. When you master your central nervous system, your body reflects that cognitive mastery through a profound, unshakable stillness. Your respiration remains deep, slow, and anchored strictly in your diaphragm, sending a continuous stream of calming signals through your vagus nerve to prevent adrenaline spikes from hijacking your heart rate. This physical composure eliminates all unnecessary micro-movements. You do not fidget, shift your weight defensively, tilt your head in agreement-seeking patterns, or touch your neck and face to relieve social tension. Your posture remains grounded, open, and relaxed, occupying space naturally without aggressive overcompensation. This stillness communicates to surrounding operators that your baseline is far too deeply anchored in your own standards to be altered by cheap provocations or emotional bait. Furthermore, this nonverbal signature fundamentally transforms your vocal mechanics, conversational pacing, and temporal control during high-friction interactions. An emotionally balanced operator speaks in an unhurried, down-toned register, ending statements with a flat, authoritative pitch rather than an upward, questioning inflection that begs for validation. When confronted with hostile questioning, passive-aggressive jabs, or unexpected social pressure, you feel zero internal compulsion to respond instantly or defend your position with rapid, over-explained justifications. Instead, you hold an unblinking, neutral gaze and allow a deliberate, comfortable pause to stretch across the interaction. This intentional delay demonstrates that every input you process is filtered through cold, rational analysis, rather than immediate emotional reflex, forcing the provoker to confront the total failure of their manipulation attempt while adapting to your controlled temporal rhythm. Ultimately, establishing the nonverbal signature of emotional balance transforms your physical presence into an impenetrable wall of situational authority. Surrounding individuals do not need to read your mind or listen to a lengthy explanation to gauge your status. Their subconscious minds register your physiological cues within seconds. When observers witness an individual whose facial muscles remain completely neutral under fire, whose vocal cadence stays firmly grounded under pressure, and whose posture exhibits zero pacifying leaks, they intuitively recognize high-level self-command. Your unshakable non-verbal frame acts as a silent psychological mirror, instantly exposing the frantic, uncalibrated energy of anyone attempting to rattle you. By taking deliberate control of your physical output and mastering your nonverbal mechanics, you secure absolute leverage in every social ecosystem, commanding quiet, undeniable respect without ever uttering a single aggressive word. By constructing this strategic gap, you systematically convert emotional bait into cold, objective, tactical data. When a hostile input, such as a passive-aggressive jab, an unfair accusation, or an aggressive provocation, breaches your physical perimeter, the unconditioned mind treats it as an immediate personal threat, requiring an urgent defense. A high-status operator, however, uses the strategic gap to freeze the interaction internally, stepping back into a posture of clinical observation. During this deliberate pause, you do not focus on how the input made you feel. You analyze why the input was delivered. You evaluate the provoker's underlying motives, assess their nonverbal vulnerabilities, and determine whether responding to their bait actively advances your long-term objectives. Stripping external stimuli of their emotional charge allows you to process hostile maneuvers with surgical clarity, neutralizing their intent before they can destabilize your frame. Executing this cognitive gap in real-time interactions relies on immediate physiological discipline and temporal command. The moment an unexpected stressor hits your environment, your immediate physical priority is to freeze all nonverbal microexpressions and hold a steady, unhurried breath. You suppress the automated urge to fill the silence, over-explain your position, or display defensive body language. Instead, you allow the silence to stretch across the room, shifting the psychological pressure back onto the individual who attempted the provocation. This intentional delay forces the external observer to sit in the stillness of their own uncalibrated behavior, exposing their lack of internal control, while you calmly select the precise, high-leverage response required to maintain situational dominance. Ultimately, mastering the art of decoupling stimulus from response grants you absolute immunity against emotional manipulation across all social and professional hierarchies. When surrounding operators realize that throwing insults, manufacturing urgency, or applying social pressure yields zero immediate reactivity from your frame, their leverage completely evaporates. You cease to be a predictable biological reactor that can be nudged, baited, or maneuvered by low-level psychological tactics. By enforcing a deliberate cognitive boundary between input and action, you retain complete ownership over your neurochemistry and decisions. You navigate high-friction environments with quiet, unshakable certainty, transforming potential emotional traps into massive tactical advantages while preserving your ultimate personal sovereignty.